introduce our old friend, Jim White. He was a leader here for 6 years until about 2 years ago, and so much more. He's a member of Bronx Climate Justice North and does a lot of work as well in Harlem, and is a retired lawyer, and he's just a really good friend. So let's bring up Jim White.
Thank you, Liz. And special welcome to our Manhattan College students. Having gone through too many years of undergraduate and graduate education, I know what you're going through. So please know we're pulling for you. We don't like candles here, but maybe I'll like one at St. Mary's. But in any case, we're glad to have you today. It's wonderful to be here. I'm also a member of you, and my 6 years here I will always treasure. As leader, I can rarely be here Sunday mornings because my coalition in Harlem is doing really a lot of active work around Black Lives Matter issues, particularly ending the war on Black and marginalized people. And most of that happens on Sunday mornings because half of our coalition is Jewish, so go figure. They're able to come Sunday and people come after church. And so I'm there and wish I could clone myself and be here as well. But it's great to be here today. And I should start with water because water is life. So in our one-to-one, and I'm so glad that the issue of environmental racism and asthma was on many people's minds, I'm dedicating this talk today to a very dear friend, Robert Daniel Jones. When I first came to New York grad school, I lived in Harlem, and I had always worked in Harlem or the South Bronx. And I'm in my 22nd year of doing volunteer work centered around what I like to call St. Mary the Militant. This is not your usual Episcopal church. I'll give you some vignettes some other time. But I worked with the sexton at St. Mary's for years and years. A guy who grew up right there in the grant projects and always worked there. And was, Salt of the Earth doesn't even describe fully what Robert was to scores and scores of people. He was an extraordinarily thoughtful analyst of racism, sexism, war, but he never could do any organizing because he was always out fixing someone's refrigerator or shopping for someone or helping someone get to a clinic. And 5 years ago this month, in one of the horrific heat waves, it was much worse than yesterday in Harlem, Robert and a bunch of others were clearing debris out of the churchyard. And another example of horrible racist deprivation has been the Columbia takeover of Southwest Harlem. The move that we organized against for 10 years, and by golly, we lost. It's amazing that we lost to one of the wealthiest institutions in the world, with every politician but one selling its out and so on. But Columbia then was going forward with demolition of a huge bunch of warehouses, and poisoned powder had suffused the entire neighborhood. It was, so palpably thick that, it really had to be washed off. It couldn't be wiped off. And we knew Robert had asthma. And in that heat and with that poison debris, he collapsed and was rushed to Presbyterian Hospital. I think he got good care there. My buddy, the priest Earl, and his wife and sons were there. But in that ensuing night, Robert had 2 horrible heart attacks and died. And we had no idea that was the risk. But the next morning, we found out, and people in the neighborhood, not just church people, but everyone whose lives are touched just gravitated into the church that day because of the horrific loss. And to my mind, this is one of the most palpable instances of the racially disparate impact of climate change and environmental racism. And we need today to analyze this considerably more. We thank Jen for the wonderful slideshow. A picture is worth 1,000 words, so please you can tune me out and turn and look at the slideshow and you'll learn probably more than I would say. But we need to analyze and we need to celebrate the wonderful actions that have occurred and will occur over the last week against this travesty, and to deepen our commitment to change. So, in Harlem, a few years ago, a bunch of us gathered and named all of the people of color we had been friendly with who died. Black, Latino people, and the approximate ages they died. And, you know, to drive home that this travesty is a life and death one, we totaled up, we, did a median. We left out Miss Hilton, who died at 99, and what a life did she lead, and a few infants. But it turned out that the median age of our friends who had died was 46 years old. Horrifically lower even than the national average for lifespan for people of color. Absolutely an example of the disparities, economic, social, the oppression that is visited on people of color daily, and climate change and its degradation. So I'm going to start us off with a quote from Dallas Goldtooth. Anyone know who Dallas Goldtooth is? Jane, tell us who Dallas is.
He's one of the young leaders of a group called Indigenous Environmental Network. He's been an outstanding spokesperson for the Standing Rock effort.
Absolutely. And so Dallas tells us that frontline communities are the people often living directly alongside fossil fuel pollution and extraction. Overwhelmingly, indigenous peoples, Black people, Latinos, Asian, Pacific Islanders, people in working class, poor and peasant communities in the US and around the world. This, with climate change disruption and extreme weather events, we, those, are hit first and hit worst. I think that first and worst really summarizes the picture of racial disparity and environmental costs that we're facing now. So, notes, I'm getting old. My friend Armando helped us with our observation for climate change in Harlem yesterday morning. Armando Howard is a climate scientist, and he's indicated willingness to be part of our work as well. He stressed that globally, the South Hemisphere is considerably more victimized by climate change than the Northern Hemisphere. But the North has produced, by far, the vast proportion of greenhouse gases that are fueling this. I think the typhoon Haiyan, I think it is, right, that hit the Philippines is a terrible example of this. Two of my friends have just returned from the Philippines and have compelling stories of the kind of devastation that most horrendous of typhoons caused there. 12 years ago, and we have some very telling photographs here, that the first and worst came through to us over that Labor Day weekend when we watched the devastation in New Orleans, visited by Hurricane Katrina. As Jen points out, residents of New Orleans, particularly African American, refer to this as the federal flood because it was caused by a confluence of factors, Army Corps of Engineer failures, as well as local government, and ongoing the failure of FEMA adequately to respond, that victimized people horribly. FEMA called this simply the most catastrophic disaster in human history. The fifth of 11 hurricanes in the 2005 season. Total deaths in the Gulf Coast were 1,833. 80% of New Orleans by the 29th of August had been flooded. So New Orleans' population in 2000 was 484,000 and some, and now it is 384,000 and some. The lower Ninth Ward still shows a feeling of desolation if you've been there. And the real travesty is that roughly 100,000, mostly African American people from New Orleans, have become permanent refugees. We're going to talk a little bit in a few minutes about the refugee crisis worldwide, but this is what we experienced here. And a number of my friends who lived in the Bronx then began to harbor refugees from New Orleans, and we began to hear stories of the incredible trauma that they and their families had been through. Then on October 29th, there's something about that date, the 29th. Beware the 29th of any month. Yesterday was a particularly good one, I would say, and how appropriate for climate justice. October 29th, 2012, our 5th anniversary of this is approaching. What hit New York on October 29th? Yeah, Hurricane Sandy. They don't even call it a hurricane. It actually downgraded to a really strong storm, but it showed how incredibly vulnerable major cities are. Communities of color recount the struggle to rebuild that has occurred in places you're not aware of, mainly before Rockaway. It hasn't happened. Many residents of the eastern portion of the Rockaways are still unable to return there. Mostly rentals, SROs, 2 and 3 family houses. More than 200 survivors were still displaced 2 years later. Hundreds were housed in hotels that sounds pretty nice. I mean, these were good hotels, but the problem is they were housed very far from their schools. The child welfare group began to fault families for not getting them to schools or clinic appointments when they were not given fare cards to be able to do that. They were housed in places where food stamps could not be accepted. And my coalition in Harlem had the privilege of working with one of these families. My friend Ellen, the doctor, volunteered in an armory here in the Bronx, where a huge number of refugees from Rockaway were housed. Horribly and dangerously, with no partitions, really scuzzy things going on in the kitchen and so. And we came to know 2 people, Errol and Letitia. They've happily given me permission to use their names. Errol, a natural leader of people who became the spokesperson for the class displaced from Rockaway, and now fortunately is housed in Staten Island. And Letitia, who was flooded out of her home. And the trauma to her and her 2 children was beyond belief. She actually has lost one son to really severe emotional, adaptational problems. He's in a residence treatment facility now. Her younger daughter is an absolute treasure and does great pictures in Congregation for Justice and Peace meetings so that she can then show them and give us a chance to talk. But the main point is that, 5 years after this, only now has Letitia found housing, a stable relationship, fortunately, and some support for getting back on her feet. So, what we are suffering locally, it's perfectly obvious that this is happening globally in far more disastrous ways. Syria, for example, the horrible, horrific conflict in Syria. How did this begin? Anyone know that history? What does it have to do with climate change? That's a rhetorical question. A whole lot. Anyone know what was going on?
Was it a drought?
Absolutely, a huge drought, extreme drought that the National Academy of Sciences pointed out was so atypical and extreme. It was clearly the result of global warming from 2006 to 2009. And this became a major factor in the uprising that began in 2011 because so many rural families were starving and could not produce food. They came into cities. And the Assad regime had always been brutally divisive and oppressive. But once there were people massed in cities, it began to crack down in arguably genocidal kinds of ways. And this has led to what is a not-so-proxy war between Russia and the U.S. Does this have anything to do with fossil fuel? That's a rhetorical question. The war is, in fact, over control of Sunni-based oil and Iranian oil, and over a pipeline that is planned to ship it through Syria to Russia's only Mediterranean port. This is globally really scary because this is one or two flashpoints that could escalate and spread much more widely, and directly rooted in both the competition for fossil fuel and the effect of consuming it, which was the terrible drought. So, didn't anyone know that there was an Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs in the UN? I didn't until 6 weeks ago. His name is Stephen O'Brien, and going on with this theme of drought and conflict over fossil fuel, he said that, you know, the refugee problem is horrendous, civilian casualties in war are horrendous, but the worst humanitarian crisis since World War II is developing in sub-Saharan Africa because of the extraordinary drought from east to west that is imperiling people in Yemen, in Sudan, Yemen of course is Asia, in Somalia, in northeast Nigeria. And in these cases, each of them, there is a component where multinational countries are vying to fight for access to the fossil fuels that are either produced there or are shipped through selling points like the Gulf of Aden. And finally, one doesn't think about ISIS in connection with fossil fuel conflict particularly, but there's an incredible article published this January entitled Oil-Fueled Insurgencies, Lootable Wealth, and Political Order in Syria, Iraq, Nigeria by a guy named O'Callaghan and a guy named Scotch. This is online, and it directly traces the rise of ISIS and Islamic fundamentalism to the conflict over controlling fossil fuel. So, famines are also caused not just by drought, but too much water. And that's another factor that we have to look to in terms of the racial disparities of where this is occurring. Anyone know what's happening to the water level in Bangladesh and what horrific effects that's having? Arsenic is building up in a huge percentage of the wells in Bangladesh. And of course this causes long-term poisoning and death. But also the water level rising, occasioned from sea level rising, is causing loss of arable land, which again is interplaying into expanding famine in South Asia. So are the disappearing nations. People have heard of the Polynesian, Caribbean, Latino nations that are all sinking and will disappear because of sea level rising. Marshall Islands, Kiribati, Tuvalu, Tonga, the states of Micronesia, the Cook Islands, but also Antigua in our hemisphere, Nevis, and also the Maldives. All are falling prey and will create huge total population refugees over the next decades. So the horrific racially disparate impact of climate change is highlighted by our friend Dallas, but he also goes on to say a major truth that Bronx Climate Justice North was formed around, which is that people in color are not only the first and worst victimized, but there are also hundreds, thousands, millions in places are leading the fight against the effects of global warming and their causes. Our sisters and brothers are leading the struggle against oppression, and this, of course, is to benefit all of us. They're now giving life-saving leadership, and this, of course, should come as no surprise. The fight against racism is as old as the brutal oppression of divisive scourge of pitting one against another over color skin. This was created to justify the African slave trade in the 16th and 17th centuries, first begun by Portugal, then Spain, and then carried on with a vengeance by Britain in its colonizing efforts. But the thousands of slave revolts that occurred because of this, but we should memorialize 1512, 1492, because the enslaved indigenous people on Columbus's plantation in Santo Domingo took place then. And those slaves were successful and actually escaped into the mountains of what is now the Dominican Republic. We have to learn from the many examples of frontline leadership against environmental racism. I'll just share a few. From 1991 to 97, Carlos Padilla led an ultimately successful fight against Bronx, Lebanon's hospital incinerator program in the South Bronx. And we here at RISAC had a pretty important part in that. You all remember Vivian Salvador? Oh good, I'm so glad some do. Vivian was one of our most perennial activists and helped to lead the coalition that ultimately won against that incinerator. She was also an incredible supporter of indigenous peoples and their rights, and I miss her. We, of course, used to debate Nancy Pelosi. I still don't know what she had against Nancy. But Vivian was an example of an ethnocultural activist that shapes the character of this community to this day. Also, in the South Bronx, Jen also mentioned the fight, and we have pictures, I think, led by Michael Johnson and South Bronx Unite in the struggle against the invasion of thousands of fresh, direct diesel fumes spouting trucks into the poorest, most asthma-afflicted neighborhood in the United States. In Harlem in 1988, we Act for Environmental Justice formed the fight against the North River sewage plant and the construction of the MTA's bus depot. And what resulted in that fight is Riverbank Park, which is actually a pretty wonderful community facility. But it took intense grassroots activism to accomplish that. They're now working on creating a center for environmental justice and describing examples of living wage jobs that create renewable energy sources. In the Massive People Climate March of 2014, frontline communities helped to build huge popular outpourings demanding climate action. And our BCJN chapter came out of our participation in that wonderful experience. And RISAC, I think we'd agree, RISAC played a role in building that, right? And by the way, you should look at Thursday's Riverdale Press. I mean, it's almost like a RISAC publication. Wonderful picture of us, Jen, particularly in 2014, and a darn good editorial. Who knows? Miracles happen. Pass this around. But most recently, and Jen mentioned and has pictures of this, the sharpest example of people of color leading all of us in the fight against fossil fuel domination occurred in Standing Rock in North Dakota. Along with the thousands of allies, including over 2,000 U.S. military veterans and delegations from many religions, denominations, other organizations, they brought to a standstill this horrific blight on our earth, the construction of a 172-mile-long Dakota Access Pipeline that would send 470,000 barrels a day of Bakken crude oil through 50 counties in 4 states under the Missouri River, threatening its entire watershed, not just those of indigenous peoples, toward an oil tank farm on the Mississippi in Patoka, Illinois. The project had been rerouted from a largely white city, Bismarck, North Dakota, another stark example of racial injustice. Also, as you've seen and Jen pointed out, the repression of the Standing Rock rebels was and still remains one of the most vivid examples of racist police suppression that we've seen in this country, and very much brought to mind the use of dogs, water cannons in Selma, in Alabama, during the Civil Rights Movement. So, time is marching on. I will edit, because I do want us to have time to plan. The fight against DAPL is now one of divestment. We had a really gutsy march in Teaneck against 3 of the offending banks. We were giving credit to this back in March. Again, a climate change day of freezing temperatures that were way below the norm for March. And this coming Tuesday at Trump Tower, Jen will tell you more about a really interesting divestment action that should be exciting. My wife is doing the grandkids so that I can go, and I'm really grateful to her. Jen will talk about that in the announcements, right? And of course, we come to this weekend and the incredible actions that have taken place throughout the country, some places in the world. At least 200,000 probably in Washington. I'll just quote Charlie Furman's summary of the experience in Washington. The beauty of our movement is created by hundreds of artists from local communities working to create imagery of visuals that keep us going. The power of our movement is rooted in the organizational work of frontline environmental justice, indigenous, and grassroots organizations throughout the country. And I had a really cool experience both in Harlem and in Brooklyn, where we linked up the issues of racist repression, police killings, deportations, all connected in terms of what is happening for competition for fossil fuel and the effects of global warming. We demanded system change, not climate change. We'll talk about the demands when we have some organizing meeting. Finally, I have to say, though, the backbone for our struggle are our sisters and brothers who live in Harlem and live in the Bronx, rooted in communities the most horribly oppressed by these racist conditions, but themselves becoming empowered to be leaders against them. I'll just mention a few names. Darren, Linda, Sheila, Tara, Laquila, Randy, Saida, Jamari. Jamari was a great marcher yesterday in Harlem. We gotta meet Jamari sometime soon. He just turned 6. Nishaya, Sherelle. These dear co-workers of mine, many of them I'm into the 22nd year of friendship with and learning from and working with them. These are the people who give the backbone through their visceral experience of oppression, the incredibly righteous anger that comes from this, and the directing of that anger out, both at the source of the oppression and to those of us who are not as oppressed, who want to be allies, who want to unite, and want to organize together with them. So, it's like a quarter after, so I'm going to wrap up by saying that we have really horrific times that we're living in, and times of great opportunity. The only gift that Donald Trump's election gave me was that a lot of people, including my son, who had thought about becoming activists, are actually becoming activists. And this is incredibly encouraging. There are not just demonstrations for people to participate in, but every voice in every community, organization, congregation, adult ed classes, there are places now to make connections and build the struggle at many different levels, where I think people understand what's at stake vastly more deeply than we have done perhaps ever. And for this, we have to thank our sisters and brothers of color who have led the fight, really since racism was invented to justify enslavement for 500 years. And we're finding out, as my good buddy Finley in Chicago always said, people of color are on the bullseye, but most of us are on the target. So let's unite.